Okay, so hi everyone. Today we'll be learning about several free online mapping tools that have been pulled together into the Environmental Justice Mapping Tools Guide. And we'll probably be saying EJ from here on out, which stands for Environmental Justice. As a disclaimer, inclusion of a mapping tool in this guide does not constitute an endorsement, and New York Sea Grant cannot vouch for the accuracy of the data within each tool. So we have a lot of people on the line coming from different places, different, working in different fields. And so we recognize that not everyone is going to use these mapping tools in the same way. Today we'll share some examples of how we use the tools in our work, but we encourage you to ask your own questions and explore the data in a way that is informed from your own experience and interests and needs. One more thing, we also had a request for a certificate of completion. This webinar does not provide any type of official credit, but if you would like a certificate of completion, you can email me and Monica will drop my email in the chat. Okay. So we want to begin by acknowledging that Indigenous communities, along with Black communities and people of color, have led and continue to lead the environmental justice movement. So I want to acknowledge that I'm on the territory of the Lenape and Munsee, and we're all able to be together virtually today. So to introduce one of the mapping tools in the guide, we'd like you to go to the website for native land, and we'll drop that in the chat, and locate where you are on the map and note the name or the names of the territory that you are on. And I'm just going to keep talking while you do this. So Native Land Digital is an Indigenous-led Canadian non-for-profit organization, and we provide it in the guide for educational purposes to help acknowledge and raise awareness of pre-settlement history. So this map does not represent or intend to represent official or legal boundaries of any Indigenous nations, and it's a work in progress with many contributions from the community. There are 574 federally recognized Native American or Indigenous tribes in the US, and to learn more about definitive boundaries, you should contact the nations in question, and there's another tool in the guide that can help you do that. Okay, so once you've found where you are, we're going to ask you to go to a poll. We're going to drop that link in the chat as well, and enter the name or names of the territory that you're on for kind of a virtual land acknowledgement. And I'm just going to pull that up on my screen.
I just dropped it in
Awesome.
the chat. Awesome. People are using it.
Great. So the goal of Native Land Digital from the website is to go beyond colonial ways of thinking in order to better represent how Indigenous people want to see themselves and to encourage territory awareness in everyday speech and action. So we can just take a moment while those roll in. Thank you everyone for participating. Awesome, appreciate it. Maybe we can take a collective breath.
It just wouldn't be right to be, engaging in an environmental justice workshop and not acknowledging the Native American lands that we are occupying. Just wouldn't be right, right? So add this to your practice. I've added it to mine. It is a great way for us to not only not homogenize Native American peoples, but to really acknowledge their history and their presence today. So just really quickly, we're gonna just tell you who we are. We're not gonna spend too much time on this. So again, I'm Monica Miles. I'm here in Buffalo, New York, and I assist K-12 educators with increasing Great Lakes knowledge and awareness within their content area. And I really began to use environmental justice as the teaching tool that allows me to do that. And one thing that comes out of this project, and me and Jess kind of go back and forth, is that we work really well together. And that's like part of the power of collaboration, is that this tool would not have been created the way it was without me and Jess having conversations and really trying to think about what is environmental justice and how can it show up in our work. So again, this work can never be done alone. And hopefully even with this tool, that you're able to take it and flip it and bounce it and tweak it to your needs, right? And so that when we say this work can't be done alone. So I was here in Buffalo, Jess is in the Hudson, and she's a mapper, right? So she's a mapper and we're having different conversations, and then COVID hits. And that's really what kind of triggered a lot of this, is that I still needed to provide and wanted to provide meaningful place-based education opportunities that educators could share with students, and that I can work with students. And mapping through web-based mapping became one of the ways in which we can do that. And one of the things that would happen is that I kept going to Jess, asking her different questions about different tools. And what you kind of really see is her brain dump onto a piece of paper that it became, I was like, this is useful. And the only reason I'm having access to this is because, we kept meeting about, about this work and about different tools. And so I'll let Jess add and speak for herself about the topic.
Yeah, no, just to echo what Monica said, I love how this project came to be, and I never would have thought to do this on my own. And so, yeah, just appreciating the collaboration there. Let's see here.
All right, awesome. Sorry, just answering a question really quickly in the chat. Yes, this session will be recorded and shared on the New York Sea Grant DEI webpage, which I will drop in the chat, I promise. So I really just want to give a little bit of background on environmental justice. So if you have been kind of like following environmental justice or hearing it, again, as Jess already said, it has always been a civil rights and racial movement, right? So it's always been led by folks of color. It's always been led by indigenous folks. However, they may not get the same language when it comes to who is talking about them, right? So when we think about our brothers and sisters at Standing Rock, right? We don't say, oh, look at those environmentalists, those activists. No, they were not considered activists and environmental stewards, although that's exactly what they were doing, right? They were literally laying their bodies on the ground. And if you follow the work of Robert Bullard, that's what he talks about. And actually the term environmental justice comes from him. And he's a Black scholar that around the 80s is when he really started to write more about it. And he's the one that actually coined the term, and he's considered academically the father of the environmental justice movement. So if you even consider yourself someone that's following the literature, I highly recommend you to read the brother that has been writing about this. And he talks about it where it comes out of rural communities in the South and how they were all attached to kind of hazardous waste. Also, just here in the United States, we have in 1994, the EPA has a branch where they have an environmental justice branch. And also in New York State, shout out, right? The DEC has a department of environmental justice, an Office of Environmental Justice that was established in about 1998. And again, we highly recommend that you just become familiar with what these resources are and what you have available to you if you're engaging in this work. And that's one of the things I kind of fell backwards into. It's like, oh, I can actually contact these offices and ask questions. And there are different representatives and people that are available to you as you continue to engage in your environmental justice work. And I'll have Jess kind of talk about the climate justice.
Yeah, so I'm the Hudson Estuary Specialist. I'm located in Kingston, New York, and my work is mostly with working with communities, local officials, residents, businesses to become more resilient and adapt to climate change. And so climate justice is really all the same disparities that we see in environmental justice are playing out as we adapt to climate change as well. And so this is going to stay with us into the future, which is why it's important to acknowledge this history and really understand it so that we don't continue on this path.
Awesome. So one of the things that we have pressed in our work is that environmental justice work must be contextualized. One of the conversations I've been having with climate change folks in education is like, well, why aren't people doing more climate change connections within their classroom. And I said, well, part of the problem is that climate change impacts can show up differently in different communities. And we don't always do a really good job of sharing with educators what does it look like where they are. Everyone is not going to be dealing with flooding, right? So how can we take the variety of ways in which people will be impacted by climate change and contextualize it to where people are? Environmental justice is the same thing, right? What we know about environmental injustices is where you have marginalized groups of people, which are typically people of color and or poor people, poor communities. They are typically the targets. And one of the things we can say about environmental justice is where we treat the environment poorly is often how we treat the people that live in those spaces. So again, it has to be contextualized. And there are going to be different layers of this depending on what your role is of things you would add. So we've linked health disparities along with how is the environment and how are the people doing, right? But the economics could be a whole nother piece, like who has access to different jobs, right, that are related to things in the environment in that space. And then also just when we're thinking about even access to green spaces. So it depends on really what you're trying to do and what are the different components that you need to be aware of. And then you'll see kind of at the bottom here, this structural racism and classism, like those are all things that are operating at the same time. So we're thinking of like, how are people being treated? Those are the systems that we're talking about, those societal impacts. I don't know if Jess, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, so we included this diagram. This is from a recent article in Science. It was a bunch of urban ecologists that got together and they're linking what they're seeing on the ground in terms of, plants and animals, all the way back to this structural racism and classism as well. And I just think it does a good job of showing how all these processes interact. So you can take something in here like residential segregation. So we had some policies in the US dating back to the post-World War II era that created residential segregation. And from that, we see that low-income and minority communities, they tend to have more impervious surface cover. This can contribute to flooding. It also contributes to urban heat islands. They tend to have less green space and tree cover, which is essential for health and well-being. They tend to have more environmental pollutants, which we'll demonstrate today as we look at some of these tools. They're often underrepresented and underserved. And then all this plays into disease dynamics, which, COVID-19 can fit into there as well. And just making this link between our bodies and the environment. And they all kind of get impacted from these same factors. Okay, so we're about to look at the Environmental Justice Tools Guide. This is not a new mapping tool, but it does pull together 22 different online mapping tools with the goal of making this information more accessible. So we're going to look at it, but there's a cover page, there's this big table that attempts to organize the data by category, and then we've got a little write-up on each tool, some basic information, and then we include this tips for use and questions to explore. And that's just to give you kind of an entryway into the tool, just because it can be a little overwhelming sometimes. And like I said, there's a lot of people on the call today. You can use these tools in many different ways. Some of them, like we said, are exploring your own context. When you see data on maps, it kind of naturally makes you ask questions like why things are the way they are. These tools are excellent for education. And that you can also get some data out of these tools that you can use for planning purposes, policy, grant applications, and other stuff. And then you'll also be able to identify frontline and vulnerable communities using these tools. All right, so I'm gonna exit that.
Also,
And
the link for the PDF is in the chat box at this time. So you're welcome to go ahead and open that up. But I know Jess is going to be kind of walking you through. So it's your own personal choice, which you prefer.
thank you. Yeah, so this is the guide. It's just a PDF. We did update it on November 4th. And this just goes to show that online mapping, it's a rapidly evolving field. It seems like new tools are coming out all the time. So we expect to update this resource pretty often. We'll always have this updated and then a date at the bottom so you can kind of keep track. And we're working on how we can better track that on our website as well. So what changed between the first version and this updated version is just some of the language throughout the document. And we also added 2 new tools. One of them is neighborhoods at risk, which we'll be looking at later today. That's added to the climate and resilience section. And then we also added a tool to the housing section, the out of reach tool by the National Low Income Housing Association. So we've got our cover page. It gives a little background. We define environmental justice. We provide the EPA definition, why it's important, how to build context. We have a little section on demographics because demographic data is really what you need to identify, these low income and minority communities. And then we have a section on data quality and limitations, just because whenever you're using online mapping tools, it's really important to understand exactly what you're looking at. So page 2 of the guide is where we list all the tools on the left-hand side. And then we have our data categories at the top. And we just made these up in a way that we thought it might be helpful to organize so you can see, what tools have what kind of data. You'll notice that some tools have a lot of data, some only have one data type, and it's really up to you to kind of see what works best for your situation. Sometimes too much data is, not helpful, and there's probably not going to be one tool that'll answer all your questions. And then as you scroll through the guide, you'll see the write-up, the tips for use.
Really quickly, inside of that, there's hyperlinks straight to those tools also. You'll find them on the table and then also embedded throughout the document also.
Yes, thank you. Yeah. So we have a section on environmental justice. We have 3 tools there. Environmental and or facilities monitoring. This is the DEC has 2 mapping tools here, and then we also have some EPA tools. We've got some demographic data, Native American territories, a little bit of health data. This is probably the category that's lacking online mapping tools the most, so room for improvement there. We have some housing data, and then our climate change and resilience section. So we encourage you to check these out on your own time. We've also included some local and regional tools. And in the back, you can find our contact information as well as links to a survey if you want to provide some feedback.
Yes, there's one question in the chat. How do your tools account for or work around the large error margins in the American Community Survey economic data?
So that would be, that's just kind of something you have to consider as you look at these tools. And if you look at the documentation, because I think that's definitely included in EJSCREEN, it's included in the neighborhoods at risk tool that we're looking at today. And so at the beginning, we do provide a little bit of language in the limitations when you're using census data. And so I think that's a good question, and that's something that we can try to be more explicit about in the future. I hope that answered your question. Because I think that data source really is what's used the most when it comes to demographic data. All right, and so with that, I'm going to move on to our first demonstration, which is the EJSCREEN tool.
And there's just one comment or question, comment about EJSCREEN, which it's really helpful for me when I work with educators and kids and we're thinking about their environment. But Jeffrey just added in the EPA's EJSCREEN, you can only view one indicator at a time. So you can't view multiple layers, which is it's it's easy. It's an easy, simple pass, first pass tool, but Jess is going to go into that. But I just wanted to share that comment in the chat.
Cool, thanks. So like we said, you can click on any of the links in our guide to get to these tools. I will say there is something weird that happens when you type EJScreen into your address bar. It takes you to a website that looks like a link is broken or something. So always Google EJScreen and then that'll bring you to this launch page. So you'll come here, you would click this to launch the tool. And I just want to point out that there's a lot of additional information. There's some videos you can watch, there's glossary of terms, and there's technical information, which will be really important for you to check out. So I've launched the tool and here I am. We're going to be looking at Kingston today. This is where I live. And we'll just start looking at different maps. So you can go to the Add Maps tool and you'll see there's this option for EJScreen maps. And the data is put into 3 different categories. We've got environmental indicators, demographic indicators, and the indexes. There's 12 environmental indicators, and these are based on major things that the EPA monitors. We've got some air pollution, some potential exposure. I think the lead paint indicator is based on like what year your house was built. And then we have some proximity indicators. So how close are you to a wastewater discharge point, that kind of thing. All these are reporting different values. And so if I turn one on, you'll see that everything is reported in percentiles. And I'll just say that this is particulate matter. In Kingston, it doesn't look like we're above the 50th percentile. And so that kind of makes sense because we don't have a lot of industry around here. There's no like major petrochemical plants. So I'm going to go to one that looks a little more interesting. I'm going to put up the traffic proximity. And now you can start to see the census block groups. That's another nice thing about EJScreen is it reports by block group, which is, I think it's the smallest, most high resolution you can get with demographic data. So now we're starting to see some block groups that are colored yellow. So what this means is that they are in the upper 80 to 90th percentile of all US block groups. You can also switch it up to compare it to just the state. And you can just decide for your purposes what would be better. I'm going to switch it back to comparing it to the US. And we can continue to click through these indicators, like lead paint is always a little more interesting. And then if you do a proximity one, you can see that there's nothing really in Kingston, but there's something down to the southwest where it's starting to get that darker shade. So now I'm going to move on to the demographic indicators. This is just the census data. We have 6 census categories here. Based on, research and environmental justice. These were determined to be the most significant ones for this tool. There's also a demographic index, which combines minority population and low income population. So I'll display that. And then we also have EJ indexes. And so what this does is combines the environmental indicators with that demographic index. So if I display particulate matter, you can see that, okay, so particulate matter, we know it's not really an issue for Kingston, but if it were an issue, these block groups would be the ones that you'd want to pay attention to because they are considered higher risk due to their demographics. All right. So I'm just going to bring it back to something like traffic proximity. And there's a few other map options with this tool. You can add other demographic data from the American Community Survey. That's what the comment was about. And I'll just take a minute to describe what that is. The census, the US Census is only done every 10 years, and the American Community Survey is done every year, but it's a much smaller sample size. So in one way, it's the most updated information, but in another way, it might not be accounting for everything. So you can add demographic data based on these different categories. And And then they include, I think, every single variable. So there's a ton of stuff you could look at. You can change the colors, you can add it to the map. And showing layers on top of layers is not a great way to look at data. But EJSCREEN has this side-by-side maps function that does allow you to look at EJSCREEN maps next to demographic data. And maybe you can look at other EJSCREEN maps over here. I'm not sure, but I think maybe this function is trying to get at what the comment was saying, that you can only look at one layer at a time. So I'm going to remove that.
Also I just want to shout out everyone that's been dropping different tools and local data that we did not have listed. I don't know if just at some point you want to talk about, just accessing local data versus some, because that seems to be coming up in the comments.
So having more local level data versus these national data sets. Yeah, local data is always better, hands down. This national level data set, it's a screening tool, right? So you're always going to want to supplement this with more exact data on the ground. So if that's available to you, that's great. It isn't always available, but definitely use local data if you're going to be using it for any type of planning decision or something like that. So I hope that answered or helped with that comment. So now I'm going to add this other section, which is additional layers. And this is where you can add things like schools, transportation, parks, prisons, public housing. And these are point files, so they'll actually look okay on top of the EJ layers. Another one, oh, go ahead.
Also a couple questions. It says, does this tool allow for data export or overlay? And then another question is there traffic proximity and the other options? Are all of these things defined? And then is there a percentile threshold for EJ mandate?
Okay, so sorry, what was the first one?
Is does the tool allow for data export or overlay?
Yes, and we'll get to that in a minute.
Okay.
I don't think it allows for data overlay. Like I don't think you can bring layers into this tool, but you can export data tables and reports. I don't think you can export the GIS layers.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And what was the other question?
Where is traffic proximity? Other options, where are they defined?
So they are defined in the technical documentation. I'll just take a minute and show you that because this is a really important thing to know. It's a PDF. And chapter 2 of the PDF, you can see it'll give you an introduction to how this was created, and then it has this really detailed overview of data and methods. So it'll tell you what all the indicators mean, the demographics, the indexes, why they report in percentiles, and then they'll give even more information on the environmental indicators, because like I said, they're all calculated a little bit differently. And was there another question?
Yeah, is there a percentile threshold for EJ mandate?
I think that's going to vary by state. Like I know in New York, we have potential environmental justice areas, and that is defined on the DEC website. So that's a little different from this national data set. I don't think this national data set, I don't know if it's used in like policies at the state level, if that makes sense. Hang on, I want to show the DEC does have potential environmental justice areas, and their thresholds are listed right here. But I'm going to get to that a little bit later.
Awesome.
Okay, so, oh yeah, there was one other layer that I wanted to show, and that is sites reporting to the EPA. And I'm just going to put the demographic index on there right now. So there are no Superfund sites in Kingston. Now I'm going to add toxic releases, and we can see a few start to show up. If I add waterfront dischargers, we've got some like along the Rondout. If I add air pollution, we're seeing some more. And then brownfields, that layer clusters right here in the same location as our low-income and minority populations. So you can kind of see based on the index where these sites are located, and it kind of aligns pretty well. And that's kind of environmental justice in a nutshell. And also, I'm just going to get rid of that map for a second. If you click on any of these points, you can generate a report that'll bring you, oh, sorry. You can actually look up this data. It'll tell you exactly what is on that site. And so you can kind of go down a rabbit hole looking at what all of these facilities are. Okay, just wanted to say that. All right, so now I'm going to turn this layer off, and I'm going to go back to the EJSCREEN maps. We'll put in traffic proximity. And now we'll look at how you can get data out of EJSCREEN. So you can use this select by location function. You can draw around some polygons that you're interested in. You can enter the lat long. You can click on the map, which is what I'm going to do, or you can enter the census block group ID if you know it. So let's say I select this census block, and then it gives me these options. So if I explore reports, I can select what indicators I want to look at between all three categories, and then I can get a data table. And sometimes the site's a little slow, so I'm not going to wait around for that to happen, but it will actually export it into an Excel file for you, and it'll give you all the raw values and the percentages. The next option is this printable standard report, which looks like this. So we have our block group, we have all of our indexes and the percentiles for the state, the region, and compared to the US. It gives us a map, and as we scroll down, it gives us more detail on what those values actually are for those indicators. And Monica, I think you said once that you could use this type of thing in grant applications or something like
and they
that.
also allow you to export the map. So like if you do, so like let's say you go to like print, it will
Yep.
allow you to export the map right at the top. So if you click print, it will pull it out as a PDF or a JPEG, and we've used them that way also to identify target areas for like tree plantings, to say where would be the best locations. Yeah.
Yeah, it'll look something like this, a PDF you can download, and it comes with a legend and everything.
I'll say one of the biggest things I've had to teach kids is the difference between percentile and percentage. So just be aware that you're getting the percentiles and not the percentages. So that may be something that comes up if you're using this with, any community-based organizations or, public spaces. Just want to make sure you point that out.
Yes, thank you. You can also get a American Community Survey demographic report or a census report, and that will look like this. It'll summarize all the data in your block group. And then the last one is this really cool CDC report. This is at the county level, but it provides some good information. We've got some basic facts, some information about asthma, air quality in Ulster County, some more air quality with particulate matter, smoking, extreme heat, heart attacks, access to parks, proximity to highways, why all these things are important. So just some good public health data there. And so, yeah, I think the printing was the other thing. And so I think we might be done with EJSCREEN for the moment. And I'm just looking at the time. And so I'm going to move on to the next tool. and that is neighborhoods at risk. And this is in our climate change and resilience section. So this was put out by Headwater's Economics, and they just made it a nationwide data set this year. This is the first tool that I've seen that links climate projections and demographic data, which is pretty cool. And it's also featured in the US Climate Resilience Toolkit. So you would just enter your community name. You can also do it at the county level. And now we're going to look at Buffalo, New York, a larger city. And right away, when you land on the page, you can see that there are certain census tracts that are already highlighted. And note that in EJSCREEN, we were looking at block groups, and now we're looking at census tracts, which are a little bit bigger. So the ones that are shaded blue are tracts that meet criteria, and the criteria is over on the left-hand side. So we have some demographic indicators and some climate exposure indicators. So automatically it's set to show tracts that are greater than the community median. And if you want, you can adjust this. So this is households with no car. You can adjust that so it goes a little higher, and that'll it'll help you refine the number of tracts that you're isolating. And you can always go back to the community median. You can look at the US average, or you can say, I don't want any filters, and get it for all the tracts. You can also switch out the indicators. Let's say we wanted to focus on elderly people. You can add that and see that it comes to kind of a different side of town. And you can add as many as you want, like so. Then when we go down to the climate exposure area, we've got these 3 indicators: areas lacking tree canopy, area of impervious surface, and areas in the 500-year floodplain, which isn't as relevant in Buffalo because there's not a whole lot of natural floodplain, I'm assuming. And I just mean that most of the tracts are don't meet that criteria. And then if you're in a coastal zone, there's also another indicator that talks about whether you're in a hurricane zone. So let's say I wanted to look at tracts that I wanted to increase this areas lacking tree canopy, so I could zoom in on tracts that were really lacking a lot of tree canopy combined with these demographics, and there you go. So once you go through all that and you've selected your tracts, you can download a report.
Just there's one question that says, is this showing us tracks that meet any one of the criteria or all of the criteria together?
Whatever ones are selected. So yes, all of them together. If you wanted to just look at one of them, for example, households with no car, you would just unselect everything and reset all these to 0, and then that's what it's telling you. So I hope that made sense.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, now I'm going to try to go back to the thing. Okay, so here's our report.
There's another question that says, can you export GEOIDs into the table for joining to census boundary files?
I don't think you can import that. Okay. I mean, you can get census boundary files, you know, from, I think you can find those online. I don't know if you would get them from this tool. Oh, I think I see what they're asking. I'm going to skip that one for right now. I don't think you can.
First to the last tool, never mind. My bad, Gregory. Keeping it together.
All right. So we've got our demographic report, and it'll summarize the statistics. And what's cool about this is it tells you exactly what you're measuring and why it's important as related to climate change and adaptation. So you can get the tables, like for each indicator it does this. So for families in poverty, you'll get the breakdown. It also has some uncertainty. So that might answer someone's question before about the American Community Survey. This report actually does give some reliability measurements, and I'm not sure exactly how they do that, but that could be something to look into. So it gives you the stats, and then on the second page, it tells you why families in poverty is important, and it gives you um, these really concise sentences that you can, copy and paste into any type of planning or reporting that you're doing, and then you can build the context around that. So it's things like, to save money, families with low incomes often have to make lifestyle compromises such as unhealthy foods, less food, substandard housing, that type of thing. And so this just helps you build that picture of why these locations are more at risk. And it does it for every single indicator, like I said. All right, so I'm going to go back, whoops, to the tool. Oh, this Zoom bar is killing me. Here, we'll just do this. Okay, and so now we've been looking at the Explore Neighborhoods section, and now I'm going to go to the Climate Projections section. And this is where you can find climate projections for your location. And this information comes from the Northeast Regional Climate Center, which is at Cornell University. And the climate indicators on the last tab comes from the First Street Foundation, which also, that data is used for another tool in the guide called Flood Factor. So here we can see some climate projections. It defaults to 25 years under the high emissions scenario. So you can see that if you want to look at, days over 90 degrees in 25 years, Buffalo is going to have 17 days. And the annual average temperature will increase from 50 to 53. We also have some metrics for precipitation increases. Let's say we want to change the time to 50 years. And all of a sudden they have 37 extra days above 90 degrees and a 6-degree annual increase. This is also written so that you can copy and paste this language into your reports or notes or what have you. And I'll just show you, you can select a lower emissions scenario if you want to be more conservative in your estimates. Okay. So next, we're running a little short on time. We might not get to questions, but we just wanted to show you a water quality tool because EJSCREEN and Neighborhoods at Risk, they don't really touch on water quality. So this is the How's My Waterway tool from the EPA. And the easiest way to use this tool is with the community setting. And we've looked at a big city and a small city. So now let's look at maybe a rural location. So I'm going to look at Sandy Creek, New York, which is up near Lake Ontario. And when I get there, it shows me the outline of my watershed. And it tells me what the conditions are for the water body. You can see that there's some impaired water along the eastern shore of Lake Ontario, but the tributaries for my water body, the condition is unknown. And if I want to dig a little deeper, I can click on that. I can see what it's been assessed for. It's impaired for fish and shellfish consumption. And then I can get more information on why that is.
So there's one that says, please touch on flooding and sea level before we run out of time.
I'm not sure. So sea level rise, we're not even, so sea level rise mappers can definitely help you understand your risk for sea level rise. And that is in the guide. Let me find it. We've included some of those for the Hudson Valley. Columbia University has one. Scenic Hudson has a sea level rise mapper. And then There's also a NOAA mapper, which we don't have listed, but we should probably add it, that covers, you know, the Long Island and New York City area. And I believe New York City probably has its own sea level rise mapper as well. So those are great tools for that. If you want to talk about flooding, there's this new tool that I had just mentioned called Flood Factor. It just came out this year by the First Street Foundation. And this is kind of the first tool that looks at all types of flooding. So riverine, inland flooding, as well as coastal. And it projects it into the future, what it's going to look like. And we didn't really have that before because of, we kind of were relying on FEMA floodplain maps, which only look backwards in times. But now we have this tool, which allows us to look at future flood risk. And I could probably do a whole session on how to use this tool. I'm still learning it myself, but if you want to explore that, I would recommend you use this one. Here's a good example of some depths of flooding. Let's see, this is this year, in 15 years, in 30 years. So maybe you can add that to the evaluation as a request for a future training. But I'm going to leave it here for now.
One question is, do you have a link for the law/benchmark guidance?
Is that, what would that, which law and benchmark guidance? Is that like the environmental justice from the EPA, the executive order, or?
I'm not sure. I can go into the next question because I'm not sure. It says, was there criteria you were using to evaluate tools for including them in your report?
I would say the main criteria would be how user-friendly it was. We did take a look at some tools that just seemed a little too complex or not as user-friendly. And we were really just trying to fill out the tools in terms of hitting a lot of different data categories. So it was important for me, at least, to include things with like housing and health data, just to get people in that mindset, to be thinking in a more interdisciplinary way about these issues. I'm sure that we didn't do a systematic review of everything. This is our very first attempt at this, and I think that there's a lot of potential for this project to evolve over time. So I'm definitely open to any suggestions or partnerships or ideas. Yeah.
Yeah, I think some of it was really like, can Monica figure this tool out? um, and how challenging was it? And actually, I just started using different tools with students, and figuring out how user friendly they were. And I'm like, listen, if I have to be a professional mapper to figure out some of these tools, maybe they're not the best resource. We started playing around with even Enviro Atlas, and we ran into a few brick walls with just some of the data not being available. So what we did was we just provided them with some feedback, right? So as a user, this was kind of our experience. So that's something else we've been also thinking about, continuing with our practices, tools where there may have been some challenges.
Yep, absolutely. So I just wanted to finish up looking at the How's My Waterway tool. You can click through on these different features. The drinking water one is pretty cool. It'll tell you exactly where this watershed, what the drinking sources are. We can see here there's 2 groundwater sources, and it lists them right here. That could be useful. And this tool, How's My Waterway, they're actually having a webinar on December 15th, and we can put the information in the chat for that. So if you want to get the whole rundown with this tool, maybe you can tune in then. The EPA also has a
Catherine
tool.
already shared it for us.
Oh, excellent. Perfect. There's also this Waters GeoViewer tool from the EPA that is just a little, like I would consider it a little less user-friendly unless you have like more, if you're comfortable using maps, but that's also a great one. You can get information that way too, and it's also in the guide. And I just wanted to bring up, we have some really good state level tools as well, because like we said before, the more local you get with the data sources, the more accurate it's going to be. And so this is the DECinfo Locator, and they have all types of information on, here I'll zoom into, zoom into an area. We haven't been down to Long Island yet. And so it actually, if you go down to public involvement, it has the potential environmental justice areas in here that you can view alongside other data points. The one thing I will say is this is based on census year 2000 data, so they might be a little outdated, but I think there's plans to update these soon, in the future. So you can just click through these and see all the different permits and registrations. Maybe you're interested in seeing where there are active landfills or you know, major oil storage facilities. If you go to environmental cleanup, you can get some more information on remediation sites. And if you click on a site, you can get a link that'll tell you exactly what's going on there. The write-ups are actually pretty easy to understand. Well, this is a really short one, but that's kind of a nice feature. And these are different from what's in EJSCREEN as well. I'm not super clear on why, but I think there's kind of the national cleanup sites and then the state level sites. Someone might be like shaking their head at me right now. But yeah, this is different. This is state level information in this tool. And there's also information on environmental monitoring, like for air quality, biological monitoring, and yeah, lots to explore here.